I do have to admit that I myself, I've never read Bakhtin's Rabelais book from end to end. It's a big, long book. I think it's about 380 pages. And it is full of, when you're asked to do a literature review in your dissertations, it's full of him reviewing every little bit of literature about Rabelais, and I must admit I found all of that part of it extremely boring. I have extracted some bits from the Rabelais book that you wanted me to say a little bit tomorrow morning, Caryl. And I will tomorrow morning talk about all the connections for me. Perhaps some of you know, it's not only Wittgenstein's one of my great heroes, but there's the Italian philosopher of history, Giambattista Vico. And Vico talks all about the first people being mute poets who had a completely corporeal imagination. Well, Rabelais is emphasizing the bottom half of the body, not the head. But what people, when they're acting in a really rather headless, mindless way, in a purely bodily way, the kind of well, at one point in my cognitive science lectures, because I wasn't a fan of cognitive science, I used to say on a dimension from computers to plants, we're very much nearer plants. We're living beings, and whether a plant has an intelligence or not, you can definitely see it growing in different ways in different contexts, and seeing plants responding to each other's growth and so on and so forth. Just as living beings, whether our intelligence is concentrated in our minds and our heads is another thing. And what Bakhtin is doing is bringing out the importance of that kind of understanding of our surroundings, as is just done in the process of our living in them and responding to them in a very unintellectual kind of way. So, okay, if you, Patrick, would like to take the chair and be the organiser of us, and we can start.
Thank you.
And yes, house lights off. Well done.
Comrades, the session of the Academic Council is declared open. This hearing concerns the dissertation submitted by Mikhail Bakhtin toward the academic degree of candidature of philological sciences on the topic Rabelais in the History of Realism. Official examiners are Comrades Zhernokleyev, Nuznov, and Zhernokleyev, Doctors of Philological Sciences.
Dear colleagues, I won't burden the attention of this esteemed gathering with an exposition of my dissertation. It is rather long. Originally, when I first approached this work, Rabelais was not for me an end in itself. While working on the problem of the novel, I came to a conclusion that might be formulated generally like this. Literary scholarship, historical and theoretical, is oriented towards what I call the classical form of literature. That is, forms of ready-made, finished being. Whereas in itself, literature, and especially the unofficial little-known anonymous folk or quasi-folk literature, what predominates are utterly different forms from finished, ready-made forms. What predominates is what I've called grotesque forms. The primary goal of this type of form consists of trying to capture being in the process of becoming, in its non-ready-madeness, in its non-finishedness. A non-ready-madeness that in principle can't be captured in any classical forms. In fact, it's contradictory and double-headed. Classical forms ask us to fit everything into ready-made shapes. None of this stuff will fit into what's already been established. So, on the basis of my material, I'd arrived at Dostoevsky, and I was amazed to discover the path that Dostoevsky had taken and how he managed to recreate this wonderful, what later I called polyphonic novel, a novel in which there's a unity of unmerged voices. I found myself drawn into this completely unexplored field. While wandering about in it, I stumbled across Rabelais, and his work is devoted to the exploration of what is incomplete, still in the process of becoming, unfinalised being, the world of what I called grotesque forms, a world in which there aren't any fixed patterns. This world is it occurs on the cusp between two eras, the era of our modern consciousness and that of the past, the era in which the Dostoevsky novel is the continuation, the development and continuation. This sort of in-between world, this intermediate world, is dark for us. It's given almost on the threshold of our modern consciousness. The language of Rabelais is simultaneously our own language and that of the medieval square. Carnival is only a tiny piece of that grandiose, exceedingly complex and interesting world of popular festive forms. Allow me to quote a few things from my thesis. The extraordinary peculiarity of medieval laughter. It's defined by, for me anyway, 4 basic traits, which are also true of Renaissance laughter, and above all of Rabelais' laughter. But they were almost lost by the laughing culture of subsequent ages. Here are 4 of these traits. Laughter had universal significance. The object of laughter did not have to be limited to the private, to the negative or the debased, which had become in the 17th century. On the contrary, absolutely anything could be made laughable. Anything could be opened up to the perspective of laughter. The nature of the second major theme, the nature of laughter has always been ambivalent. Within medieval laughter, both negation and affirmation have merged into a single whole. Laughter was organically linked to time. It was, after all, festival laughter, to processes of becoming, change, renewal. Thus, laughter grasped in one inseparable act both poles of becoming and change. Both the dying, the old, the past, and the new being born, the future. For this reason, laughter was at one time both destructive, festive, ridiculing, and joyful. The third point, Laughter is elemental, impulsive and materialistic. A central place within its images, system of images, is taken up by manifestations of material bodily life. Birth, agony, feeding, defecation, fertilization, decomposition of the body into its parts. All carnivals have skeletons and bones in them and so forth. The material bodily bottom brings everything low, makes it earthy, corporeal, decrowns it, and so on. Finally, laughter is intimately linked with the popular understanding of freedom and truth. I remember years ago reading Václav Havel, and I was in a committee and they were saying about building a new hotel in the city square, and somebody said, but that wouldn't be a proper socialist thing to do, and everybody laughed. And it was at that point, Havel says, I knew that communism in Czech Republic was finished. So carnival type festivity is a temporary suspension of official reality, a suspension of the official system with all of its prohibitions and hierarchical barriers. What was sensed most keenly in laughter was precisely the victory over fear. And I mean any kind of fear. Fear of God, fear of the sacred, fear of nature, fear of power, fear of death, and fear of hell. Truth in the popular consciousness presents itself above all as fearless truth. And I mean, and the language of laughter is the language of free and fearless truth of the people. So that's my basic theme in my Rabelais book.
Thank you. Now, first examiner, Professor Alexander Alexandrovich Smirnov. Now you have the floor.
I will not repeat all the arguments of my review, which has been made available. Allow me only to say the following. Against the present trend in our country to locate the roots of Rabelais' art entirely in the humanism of the Renaissance, Mikhail Mikhailovich Bakhtin places it primarily in the tradition of medieval philosophy and art, but which Middle Ages is intended here. Bakhtin, in keeping with the leading tendency of Marxist-Leninist Soviet scholarship, distinguishes two kinds of Middle Ages. The first kind is the official Middle Ages, characterized by social hierarchy, thoroughly idealistic, church-ridden, and feudalistic, steeped in mysticism and asceticism, gloomy and oppressive. The other kind of Middle Ages is the unofficial, that of the people, folkloric, life-affirming, yet soberly realistic, endowed with an exuberant materialism. While in the first is the facade of the historical epoch, the second is its essential content. This second kind of Middle Ages, of the common people, always commanded its own rich and dynamic art. It possessed its own special form of realism, penetrating the essence of human nature, the process of life and human relations, by means of its own particular folkloric methods. The art of Rabelais is directly tangential to this medieval folklore realism. Generally speaking, the traditions of the unofficial popular Middle Ages entered as a whole into the art of the Renaissance, making itself vibrantly present in the art of Boccaccio, Shakespeare, Cervantes, but in Rabelais it takes over altogether. The ideological merit of Bakhtin's monograph lies in the fact that it also reveals the force and the influence of popular imagery and popular art, which in opposition to anarchic individualism confirms the idea of the collective. It also confirms materialistic concepts of immortality in two senses. First, the biological continuation of the father's line in the life of the son, and second, the social immortality of the people, transmissible primarily through its own culture, developing by stages, step by step. Mikhail Bakhtin's work has been submitted for the academic degree of Candidate of Philological Sciences. There can be no doubt that it fully deserves it.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade. The next examiner, Comrade Gorky.
What I find most valuable in Mikhail Bakhtin's work is its peculiar combination of erudition and obsession, the true obsession of a scholar. His erudition is immense, overpowering and merciless. This is what enabled Bakhtin to arrive at those splendid conclusions, which in so many respects have shifted the emphasis previously established in the scholarship on Rabelais. This, of course, is a massive gain, which was made possible not least because of this obsession with one basic idea, so splendidly made manifest in his opening statement. Still, there's one thing that Bakhtin lacks, and it's a very important thing. In the end, the Renaissance and its ideology is not determined by medieval culture proper, but solely by the fact that two hostile currents exist within that culture: the official current and the folk rebellious current. The official current is often the object of polemic and fiercest struggle. It would be good if Bakhtin could write another chapter.
Oh no.
In which, drawing on additional material, he described Rabelais' position not only at the high point of Renaissance strife, but also of that merciless social strife taking place during the time Rabelais lived, worked, wrote.
I thank the examiners for their contribution. The floor is now open for the respondents from the other respondents. Will the official examiners please retire? And our next speaker is Comrade Caryl.
After such esteemed authorities have spoken, to voice the thoughts that rose up in me while reading this dissertation is rather difficult. Nevertheless, I allow myself to take the floor and will now share what I discovered while reading this work. To pose the question of realism, a movement, after all, that we all subscribe to, which has been endorsed by our best literary scholars such as Herzen, Belinsky, Dobrolyev, Lenin and Stalin, it seems to me that it's necessary to say something in the dissertation about how the views of our best people are reflected in it. And there are grounds for saying that this dissertation does not contain anything of what our leading people said about realism. If we seek in this dissertation the names of those who studied the question of realism, as we'd like to do, we won't find a single one. We won't even find the name of Engels, who gave an excellent and exhaustive definition of the Western kind of realism. Nor will we find the names of our Russian literary scholars whom we follow in our own understanding of realism.
But this dissertation was written 6 years ago.
Furthermore, this dissertation completely ignores a class approach to the events it describes, and phenomena remain simple, naked formulas. And And when you speak about Rabelais, about his language, about his system of images, in the end, that's what you're left with. Not the Rabelais we cherish and know, not the humanist and the battler against all medieval obscurantism, but a Rabelais deprived of all his class essence. That's what you're left with.
This is too much.
Order, please. Everyone has a right to speak, and everyone will have their turn.
I'd like to return to something that Comrade Smirnov referred to as the Marxist-Leninist objective in Soviet scholarship. He said the following: "The merit of Mikhail Mikhailovich's dissertation lies in the fact that it distinguishes two types of Middle Ages. On one side, the official Middle Ages, and on the other, the unofficial, popular, folkloric, exuberant, and sober. It must be said outright that this is not the Marxist-Leninist position."
Oh.
Please, keep in mind the time limit.
In fact, there's very little in this dissertation that comes from Rabelais himself. However, this does not stop the committee from concluding that not only should this dissertation be published as soon as possible, but that it must be released abroad. If it appears abroad, it must do so only as a private publication and not as an example of Soviet scholarship, which is answerable for the tasks laid down for it by the Central Committee of the party in its resolutions about ideological work and political principles in literary research.
Since the last speaker made reference to the responses of other opponents, they should feel free to offer their reactions. The next speaker is Comrade Bakhtin.
Comrades, Mikhail Mikhailovich, you titled your dissertation Rabelais in the History of Realism. I would suggest a different title. Rabelais turned backward, or Rabelais turned backward toward the Middle Ages and antiquity. This would be a more fitting title for your dissertation, because your current title presupposes not only a certain connection with the past, but also a connection with the future. It also presumes that such connection with the future can be well documented, clearly articulated, etc. However, Mikhail Mikhailovich, you weren't able to provide this connection.
Thank you. The next speaker is Comrade Brodsky.
Thank you, comrade. The official examiners might have already shaped the opinion of the academic council. Still, the opening remarks of the dissertator and my acquaintance with his thesis oblige me to request that he attend to the following question and to address it in his answer. Now, I'm not familiar with your work, so please forgive me if I've misunderstood anything in your presentation. But I want to vote impartially and courageously, the way I like to, and not in the way that the official examiners, with all due respect, are trying to shape me to vote. Now, you've presented us with two types of realism: the Gothic or grotesque, and the classical. You give preference to Gothic realism. You point out that Gothic is the unfinalized, which reflects a state of becoming and not what is already in existence. In your context, a case is made for integrity and dignity and a method for understanding the world. You consider one of the most characteristic elements of Gothic realism to be its close, unmediated, organic connection with folklore and with the common people's tradition of Saturnia, of songs, popular dances, carnivals, etc. And I assert that to the contrary. I insist that the breadth, versatility, and the profound truthfulness in reflecting the objective world in all its contradictions, in all its movements, are the unique characteristic of classical realism. Here, I must agree with Maxim Gorky, who claims that without the common people, without the attention of our great classic authors that they gave to the folklore and to what we call the people's elemental poetic energy, we would never have what we today call the great Russian classical realism. I'm a big supporter of classical realism.
Thank you, Comrade. We have two responses by two of the official examiners, Comrades Zhernokleyev and Sneller.
It seems to me, comrades, that in order to have the right to ask questions, both of others and of yourself, or to expose doubt about what has been written in a scholarly work, you must first read the work. One of those basic objections made by those who critique Comrade Bakhtin's work consists in the claim that the book does not mention the class struggle, that there's not even a whiff of class struggle there. Another objection has it that there's nothing in the work that reveals the negative, critical side of that elemental energy of the people that Comrade Bakhtin speaks of, and nothing about the people's rebelliousness, which I spoke of in my capacity as official examiner. But was Mikhailovich really obliged to speak about all that in such elementary detail, so it might be clear and accessible to first graders? Everything is mentioned in this dissertation, even the class struggle is there. Bakhtin mentions all the necessary topics, including the class struggle. He had his own tasks and goals, and those addressed gaps and blank spots in Rabelais scholarship as a whole. I do not think the objections, doubts, and mental meanderings that we've heard here today should shape the opinion already expressed by those comrades, the official examiners, myself, and also by academician Tau, who could not be present. I remain firm in my original assessment of the dissertation and believe that unfounded criticism should not be taken into account.
Respected comrades, I will be brief in part because it's simply impossible to address everything, but also because I have grown weary of this confrontational atmosphere. When we, myself and the other two official examiners, agreed to petition for awarding Mikhail Bakhtin a doctorate, this was dictated by the fact that this work so little resembled the usual sort of work done for the candidate's degree. That degree does not have to entail original research. The aim of that degree is to strengthen and fill out the cadre of conscientious teachers. There are a lot of works of that kind. They present the reader with well-known and easily understood things. Some of the criticism we've heard today at first sounded rather threatening. For example, someone asked how Rabelais could be a culmination of the past, when in fact the Renaissance is clearly an inauguration of something qualitatively new. But the dissertator had something of the sort in mind. Of course, Rabelais capped the past, just like Dante capped the Middle Ages, and at the same time ushered in a new stage. The dissertator says all this in detail. About all this, enough has been said. That's a bit of what I wanted to say. All the remarks that have been made here today are essentially correct, and that if it weren't that, they were not applicable to this dissertation. I'd sign them gladly.
Thank you. The next speaker is Comrade Zaleski.
I'm not a specialist, but only an ordinary member of the Soviet intelligentsia. I turned up here today because I heard that this dissertation was interesting, and I wanted to hear how it would be discussed. I'd like to draw your attention on a few things. First, the fact that the work has generated a lively debate itself demonstrates that the work is an outstanding event. But there's a second and less joyful impression from the presentations we have heard. Actually read, After listening carefully to the whole debate, I've come to the conclusion that those people who actually read the dissertation speak favorably of it, while those who were most critical of it admit that they didn't read the work. And as regards the comments of the first responder, well, it seems to me that whoever speaks up formally should be obliged to understand what he's talking about. And on those grounds, the comments of the first responder should simply be dismissed.
That is for the academic council to decide. After all, the first responder, Comrade Bakhtin, is not some random passerby, but a candidate for the philological sciences specializing in Western literature.
One certainty would not have known that from her presentation. All the other presenters admitted themselves to not have reading the work, so we are left with a not so good situation.
Thank you. And finally, the dissertator may respond to the comments.
Well, I'd like to start and end my concluding comments by expressing my deep gratitude to my examiners, both official and unofficial. Alexei Karpovich called me obsessed, and I agree with that. I am obsessed. But I'm an obsessive innovator, and perhaps a very small and modest one, but an obsessed innovator all the same. Obsessed innovators are rarely understood, and rarely do they encounter worthy, serious, principled criticism. Far more often, innovators are dismissed with indifference, and in this respect I find myself in an extremely fortunate position. I sat here and rejoiced while listening to my official examiners, because in them I encountered the deepest understanding, an extraordinarily sympathetic understanding. I thank them for that. I'm fully aware that my work might repel or frighten people with its unusual nature, and even with its very concept. In my remarks to my unofficial examiners, I did encounter genuine interest, despite some fundamental objections, and this too made me rejoice. I said that my main goal was to draw attention to a new world, as I call it, a new sphere of inquiry. I wanted to tease, to entice, to point out that this world existed. And the fact that in the beginning, naturally, there will be doubts, there will be questions. That doesn't discourage me at all. Doubts or objections can only make me rejoice. They're pleasant to hear. Worst of all would have been what I feared to happen. But fortunately, this fear was not justified. I feared people's desire just to brush off the whole thing as irrelevant, and that didn't happen. I'm now very tired, exhausted even, and it would be difficult for me to satisfy all of you with my answers. But I still express in advance my deep gratitude, and I beg you to excuse me if I don't fully respond or satisfy you with my answers. Nikolai Pizarro, I was certainly to take issue with my, you were certain to take issue with my thesis, but regarding your objections that Rabelais must be returned backwards, well, I can't accept that. Can it be said that when we try to establish the roots of some historical event, some tradition, we're really casting the phenomena backwards? All my work comes down to discovering the roots of the form that seem to govern creativity of Rabelais and the Rabelaisian universe. I demonstrate the place of Rabelais in the history of realism. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but it seems to me that I have managed to contribute a new page to the history of realism. So I can't be accused of not addressing the history of realism.
We got it from your own speech.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, my speech perhaps was unsuccessful. It was very difficult for me to lay out in a few minutes what I've been working on for 20 years. Nowhere do I actually say why precisely I chose Rabelais. Well, it's because Rabelais speaks our language. His is a modern consciousness. It's our consciousness. While at the same time, he allows us insight in traditions that otherwise remain dark and incomprehensible to us. And thus, not only do I not tear Rabelais away from the Renaissance, that's the very reason his Renaissance is so important. I pointed out the enormous force of laughter in antiquity, its role in creating the first critical Socratic consciousness, the revolutionizing force of medieval laughter is the true hero here. As concerns carnivals, I didn't have in mind carnival as something cheerful. Not at all. In every carnival image, there is the presence of death. Speaking in your terminology, carnival is a tragedy. It's only here that tragedy is not the final word. I'd now like to address the objections of Comrade Tyryaeva. I must admit that I found them somewhat surprising. It seems that Comrade Tyryaeva would have been happy if she could have found in my dissertation only what she herself had already thoroughly studied. But in my work, I purposely tried not to write about things that everybody already knows, everything that they've already talked and written about. There are many who like old truths, but I didn't want to be one of them. My work is unpromising in its principles. It is deeply revolutionary. It moves forward and offers something new. Indeed, my entire work speaks about a revolutionary author, Rabelais. And yet you, Comrade Tyryaeva, found nothing revolutionary in it. I make bold to assert that my book is revolutionary, and I can be a revolutionary even as a scholar. What else is the revolutionary essence, if not setting out as a scholar to address a certain problem and address it in an innovative way? Thank you.
What was the committee's outcome?
Yes, we need a decision.
He was awarded his doctorate.